Hello, everyone. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Hi, Patty. How are you this evening?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Had a decent day's work. It's still sunny. I'm doing this instead of cutting the grass. So, I mean, either or, yeah.
Well, tonight we're going to actually talk about something I discovered maybe 2-3 weeks ago. I was reading through some stuff and I came up with this story about John Steinbeck, the author. So
Okay.
John Steinbeck, when he got married, he lives in Southern California, and his wife had grown up in the area where they bought their home. And she would talk to him about something called the Dark Watchers, which were these giant figures that would stand up on this mountaintop. They would look like they were wearing a cape and a hat, and they were just silhouettes. You would never see them as anything but a silhouette, and they looked to be 10 feet tall, and they would appear before dusk in different spots along the mountains above where they lived. And she was familiar with it because she had grown up in that region. And for hundreds of years, these dark watchers have been appearing. And so he actually thought it was just kind of folklore at first, and then eventually he had an encounter where he saw the dark watchers. And not that he needs it, but their son Thomas, actually wrote a book about the Dark Watchers, because as a child growing up, he saw them on multiple occasions. And lots of people see them. Like, there's records going back to the conquistadors, to Native Americans, to the first Anglos who came out to the area, all of which have had experiences with them. And so hundreds of years of documentation.
Wow.
And so that got me to wondering, what were the Watchers? And I don't know that this is the answer, but interestingly enough, as I began to do research on it, my first thought was maybe they were like shadow people.
Okay.
But they don't seem to fit that bill exactly.
Yeah, and 10 feet tall, that's not really your average shadow person. Yeah.
So I started putting in variations and starting to look at it. And I knew that in the Bible there was a very oblique reference to these angels who were the Watchers. And everything started taking me back to a book that did not make it into the Bible, but the Book of Enoch. So for those who are not aware, there was a Catholic canon, that grouping that got together and decided which of the books, because they were the ones in power at the time, and which of the books would go into the Bible. And one of the books that was looked at and determined to not end up being part of the Bible was the Book of Enoch. Now, the Book of Enoch is really interesting. Have you read it?
It's fascinating. The last time we talked about it, I ended up downloading the PDF, and I didn't leave my chair until I had finished reading. And there were all kinds of prefaces by different. In fact, I downloaded it more than one place, and just they were all different. Each one had a preface. And some of the prefaces were almost as long as the book itself, which was interesting.
Yeah, there's so much information, and it explains so much about a lot of the biblical stories that we don't really have a backstory on, and Enoch explains them.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to if you haven't read the Book of Enoch, you can download it, like Stu said, for free, and just sit and read it. You will be absolutely fascinated by it. In my humble estimation, it should have been part of the Bible. First of all, there's 3 different places where different disciples, and there's one place in the Old Testament, there's a place in the New Testament where one of the disciples references it, and Christ quotes from it twice in the New Testament. So there are references in the Bible, and this book actually kind of explains all of that in more detail, plus so much more. So I went to the Watchers. So if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. So there was a grouping of 200 angels who were assigned by God to watch humanity, and they began to become covetous of the young women on earth and envious of the fact that humans could have families and could procreate. And they were also very angry because humans were given dominion over the earth by God, and they did not feel that that was right. So this is how they rebelled and fell. They went to the men of this area, and honestly, a lot of if you go into it really far, there's some speculation that they were the sons of Cain, the men that they went to, which would make sense. These would have been the people that were the outcasts because of Cain killing Abel, and so that stain was on their tribe. And so the idea that they could have angels as son-in-laws was awesome. And so they made a deal with these angels, these fallen angels, which is how they fell. And the deal was, we will marry your daughters. We want to have families. We want you to give us some dominion over, or share your dominion with us. And in exchange, we will give you secret knowledge that humans have never had, things that we know as angels that, we can teach to you. And it was a deal that these men were willing to make. So they made this deal. They let their daughters marry these angels, and the children were born, which are referred to in the Bible and in different other texts as the Nephilim. Now, when all of this happened, eventually the Archangel Michael looks down and checks on what these angels are up to, realizes that they have violated the rules of God by coming to earth, marrying these women, having these children. All of this is going on. And so he goes up to God and he says, you're not going to believe this, and tells him what's going on. And God says, take care of it. And he banishes these angels to earth until the end time. And so it appears that there are watchers that are still here to this day, and they can't go anywhere because God has banished them to stay on the earth until judgment. Now, some of the things that I found really interesting about all this as we're going into this story is that, according to this story, there were no implements of war, sorcery, witchcraft. None of that existed. That was all taught by these angels to the human beings, and all these demigods that Baal and what have you, that would end up being worshipped by other nationalities in the Middle East. And supposedly all of that happened, and that's part of the reason that they were banished as well. And then through the Nephilim, they got some dominion over the earth. But the Nephilim, there's one place in the Bible with the story of David where they talk about the Nephilim being men of renown. But if you read most of the texts anywhere else, they talk about them being bloodthirsty and murderous. And that's going to come into play somewhere along the line. So I don't know if these beings that are being seen in Southern California are these Nephilim or not, but I thought it was fascinating that the only thing that comes up when you start putting in the dark watchers, or you start putting in the watchers, or any of that stuff, are these stories from this book of Enoch. So that brings us to, are they still here, and what has happened with these Nephilim and what have you. Interestingly enough, for anybody who's interested, it actually explains in that book why the flood happened. Like in the Bible, it just says in general there was a lot of perversion and stuff, and so God had to, but it actually goes into the details of what happened. And it was not just that humans were doing that. It was that the Nephilim and the dark watchers were perpetuating all of this, and that the flood was to get rid of them and do a reset, so that it was just humans again, and all that forbidden knowledge would go away. Obviously, it didn't work because there were some straggling survivors, and it's interesting how negative stuff it gets passed along very quickly. And so I just found all of that very fascinating. So when we're talking about all of this and the Nephilim and what have you tonight, I thought I would pass that along because I was fascinated with all of that. And as you said, you had read the book, then you read about the Grigori as well, I'm sure, which are on the 5th level of heaven. There are these demonic creatures that are, if you trace them out, they sound like vampires. And I believe it's in Greece that they do call them the Grigori. So it was fascinating to read this book. It is completely different than any of the other books that I have read of the Bible. It goes into so much more detail. What did you think of the book?
At first, I found it a little difficult to follow, just because of the language, and maybe it was just the translation, but that's why I got several of them. And like I said, I was just, there are certain books that when I start reading, I don't want to put down because, well, if I know how it ends, if it's a book I've read before, I'm gonna continue to read it because I enjoy it. This one just held me, I don't want to say captive, but I wanted to read more and more and more because the thirst for knowledge,
right,
is what I felt when I was reading it. Yeah, almost like forbidden knowledge.
Because we've always been told that everything in the Bible, that's just it. That's all we ever need to know. But there are other texts and scrolls out there that really do shine a lot of light on a lot of the things in our faith or in the Christian faith that we have very little knowledge about. And I found that when I read this the first time through, I kept going, oh, that's why that happened. Oh, I wish I would have known that when I was, a kid growing up.
That's why I said forbidden knowledge, because the church in power at the time didn't want us to have that knowledge.
Yeah.
So it's, call it the tree of good and evil, maybe, but I just think it was good. All knowledge is good, really, in my eyes. But
I think knowledge is usually power, and I think that might be one of the reasons why some of these books, canons and scrolls and what have you, weren't chosen, because it explained things so that we as human beings could understand it and not have to rely on the church to interpret it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the reason. But I don't know. I believe knowledge is power. I don't know if it's always good to know everything. I think that quest for knowledge is it's a part of who we are as human beings. But
I the way I look at it, God gave me the ability to inquire and learn. So how can that be bad?
As long as you can have the discernment to know the difference whenever you're coming into things. Some things are just like, there are subjects that I don't talk about here because they're just really dark, like beyond dark. And I don't deal with them here because there's always that person that's like, oh, that's interesting. Let's see what I can do. So like, I don't talk about conjuring and all that stuff because I don't want to have somebody go out and do it and get themselves in a bad place. So there's some stuff that I leave alone for that reason. But anyhow, as I was going down through this, I found some fascinating stories and I wanted to share some of them. This first one came from Phantoms and Monsters, which is a really cool website run by a guy named Lon Strickler. I've known him, and not well, but I've known him and known of him for many years. It's a great site, has lots and lots of really cool stuff to look at. And this story came from a veteran, I believe. He was a witness to these events. He was stationed both in Iraq and later on in Afghanistan. So he was over there for about 5 years total. I can't imagine. He was he was a CID, so Army criminal investigator. And he was investigating theft and robbery in that area. So he was embedded in a unit in the Army in about 2005, and they were to go up into the mountains in Kurdistan. And during this brief general situation, he learned that there was some bizarre activity in the area, that the people thought that there was a creature up there that was haunting them, attacking them, stealing things. Well, he thought that was just superstition. He makes that point. So he goes up to this area. It's very isolated. There's nothing but this little village, and there's some Kurdish military, and there's the soldiers that have come up here to help, to be with him as they're checking this whole thing out. And he keeps hearing about the ghoul, Ghool, the ghoul. and they're tall humanoid creatures, very long legs, very long arms, and they eat human flesh. And these villagers are terrified. Like, they don't even want to leave their houses in the daytime, terrified.
Wow.
They're completely terrified. They're sure they're going to die. So when he first hears the story, he flashed back to, there's a story we talked about, oh my gosh, months and months and months ago, during World War II, where there was a soldier who had gone mad, and he ended up, I think it was in Italy, and he ended up killing people and dragging them to a cave and eating them. So he thought some soldier had gone off the deep end and was killing people, and that the rest of this was just kind of like the folklore that got built up around it. So that's exactly what he was looking for. He was looking for a whacked out soldier who had maybe left his unit and had gone insane in the desert there, up in those mountains there. So that's what he's looking for. He thinks it's got a serial killer. And he said then one evening he had heard some reports that there had been this shrill, unearthly screaming outside in this little pass. So he says to the guys, the military guys in the army that are with him, we're going up to that pass because I want to see what's going on. Again, still thinking he's going to encounter a man. And they go out. The villagers are really rattled. They want nothing to do with going out there. They aren't going to have any part of this. So they go out. They're in the pass. They're checking things out, and all of a sudden the screaming starts again from up on the hillside. And it's like no sound he said he's ever heard. No human make a sound like this. No animal make a sound like this. Nothing they had ever heard. So he told the guys, fan out. They got the night vision on and what have you. So they're conducting this search and they're looking. They can't seem to find anything. They enter the pass and they're working their way up through. And for several hours, this thing stayed up on the hillside above them, screaming every so often, almost as if it was trying to lead them.
To bait them, yeah.
Yeah, into something. And he said they looked for hours and they could find nothing, not a footprint, not anything, not a broken branch, nothing. But whatever it was, you could just barely see it in the night vision on the top of the ridge line. And it reminded me in some ways of the stories that I was reading from the place in Southern California where they would see this thing on the ridge line. And I came across a few more. These are mostly I found it really interesting that these are Middle East stories mostly, but they correlate so well with this one. And I've been a couple other places that I've come across where you bump into the same entity, just a different name. Like, it looks the same, it acts the same. It's just people have given it a different name. So this one's about an American soldier who said that he was deployed in Afghanistan, and that he and one of his squad mates were sitting up around 2 o'clock. They were on watch, and they heard something in the distance, and so that they're heightened alert. They're thinking we need to do something, and they're watching, and they see shadows about 75, 80 yards out, and they're creeping in from out there in the distance toward them. And they get on their night goggles and they're looking for an enemy. And they said they could see a figure, a single figure. It looked human. And they were literally thinking, do we open fire? What's it doing? And when it raised its head, its eyes were bright red, so bright that they burned out I don't know if you know much about night vision, but from ghost hunting, I know a little bit about it. If you get too bright a light when you're working with night vision, especially the first generation night vision, it'll burn out the CCDs in the night vision, and they won't work. It damages them. And this thing's eyes were so bright that the goggles began to malfunction. So they're freaking out. What the heck is this? And it was like it was looking at them. So he described the eyes as neon red, not blood red, neon red, bright as the sun. And he pulls the machine gun over to where it's at, and he trains the thermal scope on the machine gun out into the distance to see it. And he said whatever it was, its body was so cold. Like that's what it looks like in thermals. You'll see the the heat signature with it. So if it's really hot, it's like a red or an orange. If it's really cool, it's kind of a blue or a very faint shadowy color. And he's watching this thing, and whatever it was cold, and yet the light coming off of it was enough to mess up the sensors in the gun as well. And he said the thing stood there, it stared at them, it watched them for a couple moments, and then it just turned around and walked away. And he said, we didn't say anything for quite a while, but we just, decided come daylight, we're getting the heck out of here. And they went back and they reported it, but they have no idea what it was they saw. That could be that cold, could move like a shadow, but had eyes that were glowing red.
I'm really surprised they just didn't unload on it.
See, that's what I have to tell you. That's what I would have done. I would have been scared to death, and I would have like, okay, that whatever you are, you earned this, man. But I think because they thought it was a man, possibly a man at one point. I think I hear that stuff with Bigfoot sometimes too. You'll hear people say, I was out there hunting, I had it in my scope, but then it moved too much like a human. And then I thought, no, I better not do this. I better not. This just doesn't seem right. But I thought it was a fascinating story. And then there's one more I wanted to share that was, I thought, really interesting. So there's this gentleman in LA. He's a reporter and a researcher. His name is Marzulli. And this is probably one of the most famous stories that came out of the Middle East. So basically, he releases on the internet this story that in 2002, there was a special forces group in Afghanistan, that they were in a remote area, which sounds like I think everywhere's a remote area over there at that point. And they're making their way up a path when they start to notice that on the ground there's debris. It looks like broken radios and pieces off of a vehicle, and just really odd to see that out there in the middle of nowhere. And then there's these great big heavy rocks, heavier than a man could lift, and they're laid in this really intricate pattern as if somebody had just picked them up and laid them out. And they're like, what the heck is going on? So they're kind of watching what's going on, what's there, and they're looking at all the stuff that's debris and the big rocks. And that's when they were suddenly confronted by this creature that came out of nowhere, seemingly. He had long red hair, shaggy beard, was a man, but he was enormous, 12, 13, 14 feet tall. He had this weapon. It was like a pike or a staff of some sort, and he began to stab at them. He caught one guy in the chest and killed him. And the team began to open fire immediately. They didn't know what else to do. It was attacking that was trying to kill them. So it did get killed. They shot it. And after everybody emptying their guns into this thing, it finally collapsed onto the ground. Somebody was on the radio calling, we need help, we need help. And very, very shortly thereafter, because they're describing what they saw, what's going on, this helicopter comes whirling in, and there's military personnel, high-ranking military personnel get out. They look at what's laying on the ground, and they don't seem surprised. But one of the officers takes these special forces men over to the side and basically tells them, you can't ever say anything about what you just saw here. And the others make arrangements for this thing to be airlifted out. And it's airlifted out. If you look it up on the internet, you'll find it listed as the Kandahar giant, which is what it's considered. But going back to the stories of the Nephilim and all of that and the Watchers, the giant stories that you run across, we did an episode on giants as well, you will find that they all describe these beings pretty much the same way. Red hair, double rows of teeth, 6 digits on their hands and their feet, extremely violent. And so it sounds like there are some of these whatever they were, Nephilims or whatever you want to call them, still out there. And heaven only knows how many there are, what they are. But they seem to also be accompanied by those dark watchers a lot of the times. You'll see the shadow people, the huge shadows with the hats and the capes, and then these things come out of nowhere. What if that is their children? What if that is how they controlled, they wanted dominion over the earth, and that these beings, whatever they are, they're half human. So they were given some dominion over the earth, whatever they are. And that brings us back around to where we sort of started, which is California. The mountain range is called the Santa Lucia mountain range. And the dark watchers, what are they? What else is out there? There are stories out there of these crazy things that watch you, and then they disappear, they bob and they move, and nobody knows. I've read a couple theories. There's theories that it's a reflection from the mist on the water, or it's a reflection from heavy clouds or something like that. But I honestly don't see how that would end up making what they're describing.
Yeah, especially if it interacts with them. That's reflections don't interact.
No, they don't. And it's fascinating because like I said, there is a series of people who have seen them, and they describe them always the same way, from this, the 1600s all the way through to today. This series of them, it's not usually one seen by itself. It's usually a grouping of them seen together, standing there with the cape. You see them only in silhouette, but you can still see the cape flying through, as the air is moving around them, and the hats on their head, and they're watching. Sometimes they'll appear, they'll disappear, they'll move positions, and there are people who claim that these beings will lead you astray off the side of the mountain if you follow them or try to follow them and get too close. Whatever they are, they don't want a human intervention, but they're fascinated by humans for whatever the reason. It was just, fascinating to read all of this. And yeah, I've heard everything from hallucinations to seeing the Virgin Mary. And I like, how does that happen? But this is something that is it's been there for hundreds of years. So whatever it is, it's obviously been there a long time. Maybe it does lead people off the mountainside. The Native American people said to not go close to it. They told the first whites who came to the area to leave this thing alone. These things are dangerous. They will kill you. That's not an illusion. That's not an optical illusion. Optical illusions don't kill you.
Mm-hmm. Usually.
Usually.
Yeah, I'm sure you've got some stories of some that do, but that's another episode, right?
Yeah. I just thought it was fascinating. I know this isn't going to be our longest episode, but I thought it was just a fascinating story. And going into it, I never would have thought. I was expecting folklore. I wasn't expecting to end up going all the way back to the Book of Enoch and learning all this other stuff along this journey. And interestingly enough, not too far from here, where this stuff happened, there have been giant skeletons found. Some of them have had like little bits of hair that have clung to the clothing that they find with them, or the skeletal remains, to tell them that they were redheads. Others, they just have the double rows of teeth and the 6 digits. So again, the two seem to come together in some way. Like the same area has the watchers, also has the skeletal remains of whatever these things are that people think might be the Nephilim.
I find it very curious that they all have the same dress code. The cape and the hat. I find that very curious. I mean, and there's got to be some meaning behind that.
I agree with you. I think there's a lot more that we don't know than we do know, but I just found it really interesting. And they're wherever they're seen, they're always seen that way. You're right. Mm-hmm. There's no delineation. The same with these giant figures that are, you know, the Nephilim type figures, they're always seen the same way. They've always got the long hair, the long red beard, the extra row of teeth, the extra fingers and toes, and they're always very aggressive and bloodthirsty. And you never hear of them being gentle giants. You never hear of them dressed in regular clothing. They're always dressed with hides, very much like across their loins and up across their chest. And they almost always carry a staff of some sort or a spear, something like that. So it's just a fascinating set of stories, and it makes you wonder, what are these things, and are they everywhere? Because there are stories from all over the place of seeing giants. There's a place in out in the Northwest where there's what they appear to be as giant children that are seen on this mountaintop by this river, and they'll appear. I've actually seen photographs of them, like they rim along the top of it and just watch. And when people have actually gotten photographs of them, it's fascinating. Mm-hmm. And there are other places where you'll also hear these stories of giants or shadow people that are huge, that are watching. Sometimes you'll hear stories about people being led astray by them, or children that say that the big shadow man told them to go this way or motioned them to come with them. Mm-hmm. Things like that. I don't know what they are, but I just know that whatever they are, they do appear to be seen all around the world.
Any sightings around our neck of the woods?
Of the shadow people? Mm-hmm. These dark watchers?
Yeah, the watchers.
No, not that I am aware of. Not in central Pennsylvania. However, the giant issue, there are a lot of, I won't say a lot, but there are multiple stories of giants being found buried in Pennsylvania. And if you go back to the late 1600s, early 1700s, and you look at like the journals that were kept by the first white settlers who came, they talked about there being Native American people who were 10 feet tall, who moved with great ease and took these huge strides. Now, they talk about these people, though, a little differently. They don't talk about the double rows of teeth or the red hair, none of that. But there's a theory that maybe that they really never did get out of the gene pool. But yeah, you'll see that the mound builders are, any place you see the mounds, the Native American Indian mounds, there's almost always huge skeletal remains found in them as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, and it's very conveniently, illegal to disturb them.
It is illegal to disturb them.
Mm-hmm.
But it was so common at one point that people would be plowing fields and up would come a bone, so they would start looking and they would find the skeletal remains of somebody. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington both were fascinated by these huge figures and in the mounds. And they both, Washington, I believe, actually dug into one to find out what was inside of them, and he found these large skeletons. Jefferson, there were so many mounds around where he was at Monticello that these remains were found from time to time, and then because of people and also just weathering them, eventually they started to go down. And as they started to go down, these things started coming out of them, and they realized what they were. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so this region has a lot of giant stories, but not a lot of shadow people stories. I mean, I know a couple shadow mm-hmm. people stories, but not that fit that category of the watchers, the dark watchers. And I have to wonder if these dark watchers are not these angels. They never got to leave the earth. We know that. So have they spread out and they're still here? They're still observing humanity, still trying to figure out how they can take it over. And interestingly enough, their children may still be here as well, the Nephilim.
Mm-hmm. Makes me sound like that, that there's, enclaves of them, in various places, but why those places? Why in California or Afghanistan, places like that? I mean, I wonder if there is a rationale behind the locations, or if that's just by happenstance. Yeah.
I'm not sure, but I will tell you that it seems like they favor areas that are warmer and areas that are more desert. Like if you would see the pictures of the Santa Lucia Mountains, they are very desolate.
Mhm.
And they remind you, at least they reminded me, they don't look like they have tons and tons of trees on them. And they remind me of some of the pictures I've seen of like Afghanistan and places where you have that sandy, barren kind of landscape. So maybe they go to places where it reminds them of the Middle East, where they first laid foot on Earth.
More questions than answers, but
As always.
Mhm.
As always, we never have all the answers, but I hope everybody enjoyed this afternoon, and that you take the time to go read the Book of Enoch, ask some questions, poke around a little bit. This is not one of those episodes that I can tie up neatly in a bow, but it is an episode that gave me more questions than answers, and I thought I would share it with everybody else.
Well, thanks. And I know how to tie things together. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing. If you aren't already, click the like button. The like button helps the YouTube algorithm give you more content like ours. If you click the bell, you get notified when we release new content, typically Friday evenings Eastern at 7 p.m. We have the Facebook groups, Paranormalist Podcast, the Paranormal Asylum, Paranormalist Group Share. We have the email address, paranormalist@theparanormalist.com. I'm saying a lot of ists. And if you happen to be watching this on Rumble, thank you for watching us on that platform. And be it known that because Rumble does monetize, I mean, we didn't choose to do that, but since Rumble does monetize, they're going to show you advertisements. They may not be perfectly aligned with our theories, okay, within the show. It's just whatever they decide to show you. Again, we'll still always be on YouTube as far as I know, but we've all expanded out to Rumble as well, just looking to increase the audience. So if you see those advertisements, rest assured that we didn't purposefully put them there. So we're not selling you ivermectin on purpose. Okay.
Yeah. Or anything else. Yeah, we just wanted to broaden it out so people could find us on a lot of different platforms. So we're just taking a little time and trying to grow it.
And we had some comments this past week from a former listener with the former regime, if we want to look at it that way. And we appreciate those, and I've responded to those in kind. Our subscribers have increased, typically by maybe 1 or 2 a week, but that's, please tell your friends, tell your neighbors that may be so inclined to look at our content. I mean, if you're,
Sure.
we don't need the little kids looking at it because they'll go to bed scared. But.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
We share, if you have friends you think are interested, send them an episode or two to see what they think. We'll keep you company on your way to work, your way home. Just sit and relax a little sometimes. I have to tell you, I have a lot of fun doing this, and I really appreciate everybody listening to us. We thank you so much.
Okay, with that, I think I'll say good night.
And I as well. Good night, everybody.